The freezing wind cut through the Ardennes forest like knives, carrying whispers of death. Sergeant James Callahan crouched behind the shattered remnants of a stone wall, eyes scanning the skeletal trees for movement, every nerve taut. His men were scattered, some pinned, some fallen, and the distant thunder of German artillery was more than a warning. It was a countdown. Jim's mind raced, remembering the families he'd left behind, the letters he'd never sent, the moments he swore he'd never see again. Then it came, the faint, horrifying crackle of enemy boots across the frozen earth, too many to count. Jim's grip tightened on his rifle, heart hammering, mind calm despite the storm inside him. This night would decide everything. One man, 100 enemies, the echo of history waiting to be written. The first wave of Germans struck like a tidal wave of iron and fury, boots pounding through the snow, rifles cracking like lightning. Sergeant Callahan's fingers danced across his rifle with precise rhythm, each shot a heartbeat, each breath a defiance against impossible odds. The frozen trees shivered with every blast, snow spraying like shattered glass, and somewhere nearby, a comrade's cry pierced the cold. Jim's mind calculated angles, distances, every step the enemy took, aware that one misstep could mean death. Yet, despite the fear that gnawed at his chest, he felt the strange clarity that only comes when survival hinges on every decision. Every enemy felled was a fraction of time gained, a chance for the men behind him, a stand that would echo long after the snow melted. Hours stretched like frozen steel, each second heavier than the last. Jim's muscles screamed and his lungs burned, but he couldn't stop. The Germans adapted, creeping through gaps in the trees, trying to flank him, their shouts muffled by the wind. Somewhere beneath the forest's skeletal canopy, he imagined the ghosts of fallen comrades whispering, urging him to hold. He ducked, rolled, fired, and in that cycle of life and death he became something both human and myth, a lone sentinel in a world turned to chaos. Every heartbeat was a gamble, every breath a prayer, and somewhere, deep inside, a small voice dared to hope that one man's stand could alter the tide of history. As night fell, shadows stretched long across the snow, concealing movement and amplifying danger. Jim's eyes, sharp and unwavering, caught the glint of helmets through the darkness. One miscalculation, one distracted blink, and it would all be over. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from exhaustion and adrenaline. Somewhere behind him, Private Hank whispered a prayer under his breath, trusting Callahan with everything he had left. Jim felt the weight of history pressing down, the knowledge that this night could become legend or oblivion. And with a breath that burned his lungs, he fired again, defiant, relentless, alive. By the early hours, the forest was littered with bodies and broken equipment, a grim testament to the battle's fury. Jim's face was streaked with blood and snow, every breath a cloud in the frigid air. He paused for a heartbeat, scanning the horizon, listening to the eerie quiet that followed the storm of bullets. Somewhere beyond the trees, he sensed the enemy regrouping, planning their next strike, unaware that their advance had already been carved into history by a single man's courage. Jim's fingers tightened around his rifle. He wasn't done. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance to survive, to protect, to change the story of the battle forever. The night gave way to a pale dawn, and the forest seemed almost still, a fragile mask over the chaos that had erupted hours before. Sergeant Callahan moved like a shadow, assessing the terrain, improvising defensive positions with every fallen log and crater. He knew the Germans would return, stronger, smarter, relentless. Each breath he took steamed in the cold air, each step measured. Somewhere behind him, the quiet shuffle of a surviving comrade reminded him he wasn't completely alone. Jim's mind raced with plans and contingencies, every detail a thread in the fragile tapestry of survival. The forest could kill, the enemy could kill, but he refused to surrender. Hours passed in silence, punctuated by the occasional crack of distant artillery. Jim surveyed his surroundings with the precision of a man who knew the forest could be both ally and enemy. Every tree could hide a foe, every ridge could conceal death. The solitude weighed heavily, but it sharpened his instincts. He adjusted his makeshift defenses, knowing the Germans would test every weakness, probing for openings, counting on exhaustion to wear him down. And yet, in the icy calm before the storm, he felt the small, stubborn spark of hope that one man could indeed alter the tide. The first patrol returned to the clearing, dragging a wounded comrade behind them. Jim's heart clenched at the sight, but there was no time for grief. He barked orders with quiet authority, moving methodically, placing the wounded where they could be protected, improvising with what little resources remained. Every decision was a balance between survival and strategy. The Germans were coming, and when they did, Jim would be ready. His mind, like his rifle, was aimed unflinchingly at one goal: hold the line, no matter the cost. The enemy returned sooner than expected. Shadows flickered between the trees, shapes moving like a tide ready to break. Jim fired the first shot, signaling the start of a deadly dance. Each round he fired was precise, deliberate, buying seconds that could mean life or death. The forest erupted in a chorus of gunfire and shouted orders, snow kicked up by boots and explosions, and in the center of it all, Jim remained calm, a fulcrum of resolve against overwhelming force. Every second stretched into eternity, and every heartbeat was a gamble that he could not afford to lose. By nightfall, the forest had transformed into a graveyard of broken branches, spent shells, and smoldering fires. Jim's hands were raw, his body screaming with exhaustion, but his resolve never wavered. He had held the line, if only for hours, and in those hours he had rewritten the story of this battle. Private Hank, watching silently, could not speak, only nod in awe, understanding that heroism often came without applause. Jim lowered his rifle for a brief moment, staring at the snow-streaked battlefield, knowing the fight was far from over, but also knowing that one man's courage could ripple far beyond the frozen forest. The forest became a crucible of sound and shadow, every crack of a rifle and distant shout echoing like thunder in Jim's ears. He was alone now, every comrade either fallen or separated, yet his mind was sharper than ever. He shifted silently between frozen tree trunks, laying traps, measuring distances, calculating angles of fire. The Germans surged forward, relentless, a sea of gray moving through the skeletal woods. But Jim moved with purpose and precision, a one-man force defying impossible odds. Each pull of the trigger was a battle between life and death, each breath a test of endurance, each heartbeat a vow to survive. Hours blurred as bullets tore through the icy air, the forest shaking under the rhythm of battle. Jim ducked and rolled, sliding behind trunks, using every natural feature as a shield. The Germans adapted, circling, probing, but he anticipated each move, countering with deadly precision. Pain seared through his shoulder, a bullet grazing him, yet he refused to yield. Each second bought him a fraction of safety. Each enemy felled a testament to his resilience. Alone, he became a force that would haunt the enemy's memory long after the battle ended. The midday sun offered no warmth, only light that revealed the relentless advance of the enemy. Jim's arms shook, every muscle burning, yet he moved with methodical focus, never hesitating. Shadows of dead soldiers and twisted branches blurred in his vision, but he didn't falter. The forest echoed with the staccato of rifle fire and the occasional distant scream. But in the eye of this storm, he was calm. One man against 250, a number that would crush most. Yet he refused to yield, knowing that survival and history depended on his stand. Exhaustion clawed at him, every limb screaming with fatigue, yet Jim's mind was clear as ice. He ducked under a snapping branch, fired, rolled, and repositioned. The Germans tried to flank, but his traps slowed them, his knowledge of the terrain guiding every move. He imagined the eyes of his fallen comrades upon him, felt their silent encouragement in the biting cold. Survival was no longer just instinct. It was a mission, a testament, a message that courage, even alone, could bend the course of battle. Nightfall crept back into the forest, and Jim's shadow stretched long across the snow. The forest was scarred, littered with the remnants of battle, yet he remained upright, breathing heavily, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The Germans, frustrated and battered, began to hesitate, and in that moment, Jim realized he had not just survived, he had reshaped the battlefield. One man against overwhelming odds had held the line, and in doing so, carved a story that would be told long after the guns fell silent. Dawn broke with a pale, ghostly light, casting long shadows across the scarred forest. Sergeant Callahan paused, listening to the crunch of snow under distant boots, then spotted the glint of discarded German supplies half buried in snow. With meticulous precision, he scavenged ammunition and grenades, his hands trembling from cold and exhaustion, but his mind sharp with resolve. Each piece of recovered equipment was a lifeline, a chance to turn the tide. The enemy believed they had him cornered, but Jim had learned the forest as an extension of his own body. Today, he would make them regret underestimating a single man. With new supplies in hand, Jim repositioned, setting traps along the narrow forest paths. Each placement was deliberate, a silent whisper of vengeance for the lives lost. He imagined the Germans advancing again, unaware of the hidden dangers, and allowed himself a brief, grim smile. His exhaustion was total, but so was his clarity. Every move was deliberate, every breath measured, and every heartbeat a promise. He would not fall today. The forest itself seemed to bend to his will, a silent ally in the war waged by one man against hundreds. The Germans advanced once more, but this time the forest fought back with Jim's cunning. Explosions erupted, snow sprayed into the air, and soldiers fell where traps had been set. Jim moved like a shadow, firing from concealed positions, vanishing into trees before the enemy could respond. The tide had shifted, not because of numbers, but because of the mind of one man who refused to be beaten. Every second bought by his traps, every enemy stopped in their tracks, was a small victory etched into the frozen ground. Hours stretched, and the forest was alive with echoes of the battle. Jim's body was pushed to its limits, muscles screaming with every motion, yet he moved with uncanny precision. Each enemy that fell to his traps or rifle was a step toward victory, a testament to his unyielding will. In the brief lulls between fire, he allowed himself a moment to glance at the ruined trees, the fallen comrades, the blood-soaked snow, and understood that courage alone had carved a path through despair. Today, he was not just surviving. He was dominating the battlefield with ingenuity and grit. By evening, the enemy faltered, their assault slowed by wounds, confusion, and fear. Jim leaned against a tree, chest heaving. Frost and blood streaked across his face. He knew this advantage was temporary, that the Germans would regroup. But for now, he had carved a fragile victory with nothing but skill, determination, and unshakable courage. The forest, scarred and silent, bore witness to what a single man could do. Jim's eyes scanned the horizon, aware that the battle was far from over, but confident that he had changed the game. Tonight, the legend of the sergeant who held off an army alone grew one step closer to reality. The forest was no longer just a battlefield. It was a crucible of pain and endurance. Every shot fired cost Jim more than energy. It carved lines of exhaustion into his body and mind. A sharp pain lanced through his shoulder, the result of a grazing bullet, but he swallowed it down, ignoring the fire that threatened to slow him. The Germans adapted, probing for weaknesses, testing every trap, every position. Jim's breaths came in ragged bursts, yet his resolve was steel. Survival demanded not just skill, but sacrifice, and he had plenty of both to give. The enemy shifted tactics, sending waves from multiple directions, forcing Jim to abandon one position for another. Pain and exhaustion threatened to betray him, but he moved with deliberate focus, rolling behind snow-dusted logs, firing with deadly accuracy. Every fallen enemy was a temporary reprieve. Every heartbeat a reminder of how close death lurked. Yet, amidst the chaos, he felt the strange clarity of purpose. The cost was high, but the stakes were higher, and surrender was never an option. A loud explosion rocked the clearing, snow and debris flying in every direction. Jim's ears rang, vision blurred, but he pressed forward, pulling himself low, firing round after round. His body was screaming for rest, but he ignored it. Every second gained was a victory. The forest seemed to conspire with him, every ridge and fallen tree a shield. Even alone, he was a force to be reckoned with, a single man holding back the tide of an army that refused to yield. Every movement was agony, every breath stolen in pain, but Jim's focus never wavered. The Germans tried to flank, to overwhelm, to test his limits, and in response, he became more than a soldier. He became a force of nature. Snow and smoke blended into a haze. Bullets whistled past, and the forest echoed with the cries of combatants and the crunch of broken branches under boots. He felt the weight of every life lost, every comrade fallen. And yet, through the fog of pain, he kept moving, kept fighting, kept defying the odds. By nightfall, the forest was a graveyard of shattered trees, smoke, and frozen blood. Jim's body trembled, muscles screaming, yet he stood tall, rifle ready, refusing to fall. The Germans hesitated, weary and battered from his relentless defense, and in that pause he realized the truth of his stand. Heroism demanded sacrifice, and survival was a matter of will as much as skill. The line he had held was more than snow and stone. It was the embodiment of courage in the face of impossible odds. One man had fought, and in doing so, had changed everything. The first hints of dawn glimmered through the skeletal trees, a fragile light against the darkened forest. Sergeant Callahan's body screamed in protest, every muscle on fire, yet his eyes remained fixed on the tree line. Then a distant rumble, a sound that made his heart leap. Allied vehicles and soldiers appeared like a living tide, moving through snow and smoke. Relief surged, but Jim didn't lower his rifle. He remained vigilant, aware that the final push was still his responsibility. The battle wasn't over until every enemy threat was neutralized, and he had earned the right to survive. Not as a hero, but as a man who refused to fall. Jim led the remaining Germans into ambushes, firing when necessary, coordinating silently with the advancing reinforcements. Exhaustion and pain blurred his movements, yet his mind remained a machine of focus. Every enemy neutralized was a victory for the men arriving behind him, every second bought by his relentless stand. The forest, once a crucible of chaos, now echoed with the rhythm of organized advance, the tide finally turning in favor of those who refused to give up. As the reinforcements pushed forward, Jim's body finally demanded acknowledgement of its limits. He stumbled, pain shooting through his legs and shoulders, yet he forced himself to continue. Every step was agony, every breath a battle, but he refused to yield until the last German threat was neutralized. The forest, once oppressive and threatening, now seemed to recognize his triumph. snow falling gently over the scarred battlefield as if acknowledging the cost of courage. The forest fell silent, except for the distant shouts of surviving comrades and the crackle of residual fires. Jim sank to one knee, finally allowing the weight of fatigue to press down. He glanced at the horizon, at the snow-streaked battlefield littered with evidence of his stand. He had held the line, not with numbers, but with determination, skill, and unyielding courage. The reinforcements would finish the job, but history would remember the one man who refused to bend, who had carved a stand from despair and turned it into hope. Exhausted hands gripping his rifle, Jim finally lowered it, feeling the weight of both his body and the battle lift slightly. The reinforcements secured the forest, and the enemy retreated in disarray. Yet, the victory was bittersweet. The cost in blood, frost, and courage was staggering. He had survived, but the echoes of what he had endured would follow him forever. One man against 250, alone in the Ardennes, had changed the story of the battle. And though the forest was quiet now, the legend of Sergeant James Callahan would never fade. The forest was silent now, a frozen graveyard of snow, blood, and broken trees. Sergeant Callahan trudged through the aftermath, every step heavy with exhaustion and grief. He remembered the faces of fallen comrades, the fleeting moments of fear and courage, the endless waves of enemy soldiers. Victory had been won, but it came at a staggering cost. Jim paused, letting the snow drift across his shoulders, and for the first time allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had endured. In the quiet, he understood that heroism was never without sacrifice, and survival was always bittersweet. Allied soldiers moved through the forest, securing the area and tending to the wounded. Jim watched quietly, his hands still trembling from exertion and adrenaline. He saw Private Hank among the survivors, wide-eyed and silent, a mixture of awe and gratitude in his gaze. No words were necessary. The story of what had happened would live in actions, in memory, and in the whispered respect of those who had seen courage personified in one man. Even as medics tended to the wounded and soldiers collected the fallen, Jim's mind replayed the night, the endless waves of enemies, and the moments when survival hung by a thread. He had held the line alone against impossible odds and changed the outcome of a battle. Yet, in that knowledge, there was no triumph without sorrow. Every victory carried the shadows of lives lost, and every breath of freedom came with the memory of sacrifice. As the sun rose higher, its weak light revealed the devastation of the forest and the scars etched into those who survived. Jim stood, surveying the frozen battlefield with quiet pride and unspoken grief. He had been tested beyond measure, yet his resolve had never faltered. In that solitude, he understood the essence of heroism. Not glory, but perseverance, courage in the face of despair, and the unyielding choice to stand when the world expected him to fall. The legend of Sergeant James Callahan would be told long after the snow melted, long after the forest healed. One man, alone, had faced 250 enemies and refused to yield. History would remember not just the stand, but the courage, the sacrifice, and the human spirit that refused to break. Jim turned from the forest, carrying the weight of memory, the burden of survival, and the quiet knowledge that the story of this night, of one man against an army, would echo through time.